Moment. Excellent. Yeah, so make sure you've turned off you've muted yourself, turned off your video, and I will now pass the microphone to David Kaiser, who will say a few words about ARARA and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you. The American Rock Art Research Association, as I think most of you know, is a nonprofit organization in order to conduct research, preservation, and education about rock art. We're an all-volunteer organization. But tonight's speaker, Troy Scotter, he grew up in Canada and graduated from the University of Alberta. And after a short career as a professional accountant, he figured out that it wasn't a career for him. So he moved south of the border and he went back to school at Brigham Young University, where he completed an MBA with an emphasis on organizational and behavior and strategy. Troy spent the rest of his professional career helping businesses solve problems associated with strategy, business process redesign, culture, change management, and executive education. Now, none of this has anything to do with rock art, but while he was going to school in Utah, he stumbled upon a Barrier Canyon style rock art site, which began his interest in rock art and archaeology. And now Troy's been a member of URARA, which is the Utah Rock Art Research Association, for almost 30 years, and ARARA, the national organization, for almost 20 years. He served on the board of both organizations and is the current ARARA treasurer and webmaster. He wanted to thank his many friends in both organizations, a plethora of archaeologists, and a lot of authors for providing him with an education in the topics of rock art and archaeology and answering his many questions. And in tonight's lecture, he wants to look at how we experience rock art. His talk is entitled Thinking About Rock Art, How Our Brains Can Get in the Way of What We See, examples from great rock art in Utah. So Troy, take it away.
Great, thanks, Dave. So I'm going to start off a little bit weird with a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with rock art, but have a lot to do with the way we think. So kind of bear with me if you're expecting some rock art specific things right at the beginning. And we'll get into the rock art. There's lots of pictures coming up. I'll go through them fairly quickly because, I threw in a whole bunch of things kind of showing different styles of rock art in Utah. But I wanted to ask you this question. Are you a logical decision maker? And Peter, I think I can do this myself. Let me figure out the polls. And there you go. Are you getting a poll up there now to where you can answer that question? Are you primarily a rational, logical decision maker? And secondly, do you know the acceleration rate of your vehicle? So it looks like we've got pretty much most of the results are in. So as I would expect, because we have a pretty professional group of people here who have, generally a lot of university education. So 57 of 67 have said that you were rational, logical decision makers. And I'm not surprised that there's 10 people who haven't said that, because there's a whole bunch of other ways of making decisions. There's emotional ways, there's intuitive ways, there's abstract thinking. So there's, I'm not surprised that there's another group of people who've said no to that question. And then the second question was, do you know the acceleration rate of your vehicle? And I'm absolutely shocked that 9 of you said yes, which is actually pretty impressive. And I'll explain to you why I asked that question in just a second. Oh, there we go. There's the share results. Okay, so I was on my way to do a presentation about rock art to a hiking group in Salt Lake. And I got to an intersection that was on a really busy road, and I needed to make a left turn to go up the canyon. And there was 3 lanes of traffic coming the other way, and they were driving fast. And, I really struggled with making that left turn. And, and I delayed, and there were some obvious places where I could have gone, but I didn't feel comfortable, and people behind me were piling up, and thank goodness I finally got a left turn signal and I was able to go through there. But I was kind of surprised by my reaction to that intersection. And as I was driving up the canyon, I started to think about the mathematics of left turns. And I'm a weird person, and I think about stuff like this every so often. And I realized that actually, making a left turn is quite complicated. So I've simplified it a little bit, and this is kind of what an intersection near my house looks like. And I do a left turn at this intersection, almost every day, and often several times a day. And so let's pretend that I'm the green car down at the bottom, and that there's an oncoming vehicle in that yellow vehicle on the top left-hand side. So what does it take to figure out if you're a rational decision maker, how you can, or when you can successfully turn left? So as I thought about it, I thought, there's two things we really need to know. We need to know, when is that left car going to enter the intersection, and how long is it going to take me to get across the intersection? And so, the first question, how long will it take for that yellow car to come? That's actually a fairly easy mathematical thing. If you know miles per hour, and my street is a 30-mile-an-hour street, and most people are actually kind of driving between 30 and 40. So, if we said they're driving at 35 miles per hour, you could start to estimate how far they are from the intersection and compute the time that it would take for them to get into the intersection. Now, knowing miles per hour isn't that helpful in that calculation, because that's too big a metric. But you could quickly change it to feet per second. If you took 35 miles per hour, you multiplied it by 5,280 feet that are in a mile, and divided it by 3,600, which is the number of seconds in an hour, and that would get you about 51 feet per second. So if you could make a good estimate of how far it was from the intersection, and you knew it was traveling at 51 feet per second, you could get a pretty good idea of how many seconds it was going to take to get into the intersection. So the next question is, how long would it take me to get through the intersection? And that's more complicated, because it involves the acceleration rate of my car. So clearly a Ferrari would get through the intersection a lot more quickly than my Outback that I drive, my Subaru. So, and I didn't even know what that equation was. So to calculate the time it will take us to clear the intersection, you have to take twice the distance, divide it by your acceleration rate, and take the square root of that product, or that fraction. And that actually starts to look fairly complicated, especially doing the square root part of it. And then the third thing is, you don't want to just get through and have the guy just barely miss your bumper. That's going to freak everybody out. And so then you need to have a safety factor. And, what's the safety factor that's appropriate for all of us, and how do you have to add that in? So my guess is, if I put up another poll and I said, how many of us have actually done that mathematics while you're sitting in the left turn lane to make that rational, logical decision, that the answer would be none of us. I know I never have. I'd never even thought about it before. And so the question becomes, how are we actually making safe left-hand turns? And I think the answer is that our brain has seen patterns in the road thousands and thousands and thousands of times, especially at intersections where we are comfortable, where we've done it a lot before. And it's taken thousands of pictures of, when you went through one time and it was a little bit too close and you weren't happy, and when you waited and obviously you could have gone through, and the brain simply says, you know what, it looks good, now go. And that is a really non-logical, rational way of making the decision, but it's the brain seeing a pattern that it's seen before and making a decision and telling you it's okay. So here's my second question for you. I really should have put polls in for all of these. Maybe I can do that. Just respond in chat. Is the color at the top of the figure the same as the color at the bottom? Okay, I'm not going to do the poll. Anyway, my guess is that most of you would say that the color on the top of that image is darker than the color on the bottom of that figure. And I want to show you a little bit of a video that's coming from a great TV show called Brain Games. It appeared on the National Geographic Channel. Okay, so here they're going to black out the middle and watch what happens to the colors. Is that, in a world where we have one light source and we get shadows shadows are, really relevant to the way we see things, the brain has learned to interpret movement and interpret color based on the shadows that it sees. The fascinating thing about this to me is that, I've never taken a course in shadows. I've never done anything like this. I've never even thought about it. And yet somewhere my brain has come up with a way of interpreting shadows to interpret motion and to interpret colors. And that's really interesting. So I'm going to just see if I can move on to the next slide. There's another person who's been thinking about the way the brain works. His name is Daniel Kahneman. He's a social psychologist. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of the most depressing books I've ever written. He just goes for chapter after chapter after chapter talking about how we get things wrong in the way that we think. And what he says is that there's two kind of processes that we use when we're thinking. There's a fast way, which is this invisible way that we just saw with the shadows. So the brain is interpreting things and providing us with a solution, and we don't even know that it's doing it. It's super fast, it's invisible, and it just happens. And there's a slow way, which is difficult and laborious. So, when we sent out the advertisement for this presentation, I asked a couple of questions. How many members are there of ARARA? Who's the vice president of ARARA? Things like that. Now, those are things that eventually you could work out, but you might go to the website and do a little bit of research there. You might think, oh, okay, I know the face of that vice president person. Who is that person? And you'd eventually figure out that it's Linda. We have about 450 members. And you could, get some idea of that. But that's a laborious, hard process that takes us a long time. It's slow, but it's very obvious what we're doing. So what Kahneman is saying is that a lot of the decisions that we make is through pattern recognition. Our brain is a pattern recognition engine, and we often aren't aware of the patterns that it finds. And the other interesting thing that he says is if the brain can't find a pattern, it will often make one up, because patterns are so important to the brain that it's going to make up something just to kind of satisfy its own needs. And then the last interesting piece is that by one estimate, 80% of the decisions we make as we go through a day are made by the fast part of our brain. So 80% of our decisions are going on without us consciously thinking about how we're making those decisions. So how does this apply to rock art? The first thing, when I walked into that room with those people that I went to visit, going and doing the left-hand turn, they're a hiking group, and they're always out and they're seeing rock art. And literally, I walked in the front door and this guy was standing there, and he looked at me and he says, "You must be the rock art guy." And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Are you going to tell us what it means?" And that's, whenever I do a presentation, that's always the first question I get is, what does it mean? And that's part of that pattern recognition part of the brain. It's looking for meaning. It's trying to understand, and it's really frustrated when we can't see it. So that thinking fast part of our brain is just looking at it and it's saying, I need to figure out what's going on with this stuff that I'm seeing. If your brain can't find a pattern, it'll make one up. So in 9 Mile Canyon, which is here in Utah, has over 800 rock art panels in there. There's somewhere between 3 and 6 sites that are called Santa Claus and Reindeer, depending on who you talk to and where you're looking in the canyon and who you talk to. Which is a silly name when you think about it for a rock art site, because the people who made that rock art site would have had no idea who Santa Claus was, and probably had no idea who reindeer were, and certainly didn't know Donner and Blitzen and all those other reindeer that were going along with Santa Claus. We interpret that panel intuitively based on our cultural understanding, and we're looking up there and we're seeing something, and especially uninformed people are making immediate things and saying, oh my gosh, that looks like Santa Claus and reindeer. So interpretation, we're often again looking at things and we're trying to figure out what it means. Not only are we trying to find meaning, but it's interpretation is so important to us. There's a reason for it, because that's what keeps us alive. It's not important just to see the pattern. It's important to understand what the pattern is. So 20,000 years ago, if we were on the savanna of Africa and the wind was blowing from the right and you looked out there and you saw a patch of that high grass, that was moving to the left, you might think, my gosh, there's something out there that's moving through that grass and I wonder if it's a predator. Or if you're walking in the dark in a trail, you need to look at all the shadows that are on the trail and figure out, are any of those shadows a snake? Because again, back in those days, it's not just that you're aware of something, but you then interpret that and you provide meaning to it so that we can make fast decisions about whether we need to run or do something else to keep ourselves alive. Culture influences interpretation. So again, when it comes back to Santa Claus and reindeer, culture absolutely influences interpretation. And our modern lifestyle is so different from the cultures who came before that we may never understood what it meant to them, but we will still try to interpret it for ourselves. So the thing that I think about now as I start to become aware of how my brain is working is that I'm trying to say, how do I engage the slow thinking part of my brain to force other perspectives about rock art that may be different than what the fast part of my brain is showing to me in terms of its interpretation of what it's seeing. And one of my tricks is to make myself think about the who and the why rather than the what. And this leads me to new insights about rock art sites. So now we're going to jump into some of the Utah rock art. And just to tell you a little bit about who lived here, in Utah, we had the Paleo Indians who were here from, again, we were just talking in the session before we started about these dates are getting stretched a little bit, but the traditional dates are about 12,000 BC to about 8,000 BC. The archaic people, this is when some climate change occurred back then. During the Paleo-Indian time, Utah was quite wet, a lot of forests, a lot of water. Things start to heat up and dry up around 8,000 BC. And Utah starts to look a lot more like it does today. And the archaic dates are complicated. Basically, the difference between the archaic people and when we start to see the people who are abandoning that hunter-gatherer lifestyle and moving more into farming, so we're looking for pollen dates. And so if you look down into the next column, you'll see the ancestral Puebloans, the basket makers, we think are going back to about 1500 BC because we've got pollen dates corn pollen dates going back that far. Not a lot, but corn is here and it's being grown. So I think some of those archaic lifeways still maintained until about 0 AD, but we're getting a transition into where people are starting to think more about sedentary living and planting rather than moving all the time. And that's that transition into the basket maker period in about 1500 BC, and they continue to about 750 AD. And the basket makers and the Puebloan people are all one culture, but their kind of technology and their lifestyle changes. So we changed the name around 750 AD to call them Puebloan people, and they continue to about 12 to 1300 AD here in Utah, depending on the part of Utah that they live in. And after that, we start to see the disappearance of cultural markers of them within Utah. The Fremont people, they were probably here from about 0 AD to, again, that same thing about 1300 AD. We start to see the disappearance of, cultural indications of their continuing to live in Utah. We do see some really remote, small habitation sites up in the vernal area, high elevation, difficult areas to live in, probably going to about 1400 to 1450, but the bulk of the population, we're not seeing archaeological evidence of the bulk of the population here anymore. The Nunavut speakers, they arrive about that same period, around 1200 AD, and they continue to present. They're still here. And the Navajo come in, probably first wave, small numbers of people around 1500 AD, but the bulk of the population around 1700 AD to present. And in Utah, they're just down in the southeast corner of Utah, so we don't see a lot of their presence here. So what clues can we use to help us think about who made the rock art that we're looking at? And I think there's a list that I've made up that I use. So what are the attributes of the rock art? You could call that style. What's the geographic location? Are there associated artifacts that we're seeing on the ground or around the rock art? What's the degree of repatination? Repatination is a little tricky, and I'll talk about that later on. What's the pecking and painting technique? How did they make the rock art? Is there superimposition, and what does that tell us? So superimposition is if there's one figure on top of another figure. Is there relative positioning? So do we see one type of image on one part of the panel and another type of image in a different part of the panel? And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. And is there unique content, or is there datable content? So here's a couple of examples that we can show. This is Newspaper Rock State Park, which is down in southeastern Utah. It's a wonderful site. It's primarily a Ute site. And to the left there, you've seen the titles that I just showed you. So we can look at repatination there. And if you look up here in the top right, this is Fremont. Culturally, it's Fremont, and you can see those figures are much darker and they're much higher on the panel. And all these figures down here are really quite light. And so repatination can show you that some figures are older on the panel, but it's all in the same facing direction than other figures are. I don't think the pecking and painting technique is really big here. There is some superimposition. I mean, you can see a lot of older figures down here as well. But relative positioning, I think, is interesting here. So having these Fremont figures way up high on the top right with everything else down lower, I kind of wonder if there, might have been some, a sand dune or something that was here in front of this panel that people were able to get up and make the rock art higher up, and that eventually that sand dune eroded away, and the later Ute people came and did their rock art lower down on the panel. And there's definitely unique content and datable content down here. So one of the datable things is that we can see horses. Here you can see a horse and rider right kind of in the center of the panel. And so we can date that to, that's post-Spanish incursion into the area. Another horse up here. We've got a cowboy with a cowboy hat and chaps and maybe kind of a saber or something like that. So we've got interesting, unique content here. The horse is really a big deal. It's a big deal for the Utes. We also see bison up here, which is a big deal for the Utes. And we're seeing a lot of bear tracks and bear marks in here, which are important to the Utes as well. So there's a lot of things in here that we can start to use some of these this checklist that I've developed to help me think about panels and what we're seeing and who's made it. This used to be the logo for the Utah Rock Art Research Association. This is in 9 Mile Canyon. And most people, when I talk to them, and myself included, when I first saw it, I thought this was a Fremont site. And I was just listening to a Zoom presentation a couple of months ago with a professional archaeologist who said this was a Fremont site. But actually, when you look at it, you look at the repatination, and there is zero repatination. I mean, that stuff looks almost, like it was made yesterday. And then the pecking and painting technique is really interesting here, especially if you look down here at the bottom of the owl. Look how wide and how deep those peck marks are. And those aren't normal peck marks. Those are peck marks that I think are made from a metal tool. So what we think has happened here is we think this is a Ute site, and that they've got a hold of, maybe some tools from a railway site or something like that, but, some kind of a metal chisel. And if you look around that whole body of that owl, you can see deep, wide peck marks. And so, even though structurally, or a lot of the symbolism here would fit very nicely in a Fremont panel, the actual pecking technique is much more new than would be associated with the Fremont. And then I think this is the last one that I'm going to show you. This is at Sago Canyon, Thompson Springs. And it's an interesting site. We had a big debate about this in one of our ARARA symposiums. So there's, attributes to the rock art here. So, these nice pecked figures really have very typical Fremont style. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail later on, but, upside down bucket shaped heads with elaborate headdresses, a lot of body decoration, tapering at the waist, sometimes flaring out a little bit below the waist. Kind of nice slant-eyed or tear-eyed figures up here. This is really prototypical vernal style Fremont figures. And we do have superimposition. So if you look carefully, you can see up here, we have got red Barrier Canyon imagery, which isn't surprising if you know the site, because just around the corner, there's a very large Barrier Canyon panel. And these Fremont figures have been pecked over the top of the painted Barrier Canyon imagery. So I had a question once where somebody actually felt that Barrier Canyon imagery was newer than the Fremont, that the Fremont became Barrier Canyon people. And it's actually fairly easy to answer that when you look at superimposition, because every site I've seen where there's superimposition, the Fremont is always over the top of the Barrier Canyon. The Barrier Canyon is never over the top of the Fremont. And then there is one really interesting issue here, and that's repatination. So if you look at these Fremont figures, you look at these ones here, they're just bright, bright, bright figures. And then you look at some of these older Fremont figures here and here, and they're much more heavily repatinated. And so the question is, what's going on here with the repatination, and what does this mean? And we had one of our members, he's an ARARA member, Francois Goyer, who came in with a large lens, and he took very detailed pictures of these light colored figures. And what he was able to show was that these figures have been repecked, and that when they repecked them, they missed certain places on corners where the old pecking still existed, that they hadn't repecked over the top of it. And so you could see the old pecking kind of around the edges, but that somebody had come back and repecked it. And actually, after the presentation, there's a Ute fellow that I know who came up to me and he says, Troy, I have to tell you a story. He says, that was my great, great, great grandfather. I don't remember how many greats there were. He says, but, it's our family tradition that, our great, great, great grandfather made this site originally, that he was the one who put this Fremont imagery up here. And so my grandfather decided that he needed to refresh the site. And so he was the one who came back here with a ladder and repecked the site so that great-great-great-grandfather's images were refreshed, which I thought was an incredible story, which was very interesting. Okay, so rock art styles in Utah, and I'll be going through each of these: Great Basin Curvilinear, Glen Canyon Style 5, Barrier Canyon Basket Maker, Puebloan, Fremont Ute, Paiute, Cave Valley. We've also got Navajo and Shoshone. I'm not good on either one of those. All of my Navajo rock art I actually have from outside of Utah, and the Shoshone I just don't know much about. So I have excluded them. That's why they're in the red, but they're here in the state. You can see the Navajo down near Bluff, and you can see the Shoshone up in the northern part of Utah. So Glen Canyon Style 5. This style was first identified by Christy Turner in 1963. I use some of my own definitions just because I think the Style 5 is a little bit different in Utah than it is in the Glen Canyon area where he was looking. These are two Glen Canyon Style 5 anthropomorphs. And this is actually in a canyon called Bug Canyon, and you can kind of see why it got its name like that. The heads are circular or oval. They often have antennas. They're bisected, sometimes horizontally, sometimes vertically. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's a mask. I was in another site where they didn't have bodies, and all there were these heads, and it kind of freaked me out. Each head was a different design, and they were quite interesting. Here, the bodies are real simple stick figures, and I'm going to show you some later pictures coming up next where they're more complicated bodies. The zoomorphs, the bodies tend to be outline pecked and created with straight edges and square corners with horizontal and vertical pecked lines, and I'll show you a good example of that in a minute or two. And oftentimes you'll see these kind of random dot patterns that spread out across these panels. So here's a nice diagram by Ann Phillips and the Sand Island documentation team of some Glen Canyon Style 5 anthropomorphs that were down near Sand Island. And again, you can see a little bit more elaborate bodies, but that same style of head, but not the stick figure bodies that we were seeing before. And here's a photograph of some other Glen Canyon Style 5 figures, again with the more elaborate bodies, but similar kind of head features. And this is at the famous Butler Wash panel that's just layer on layer on layer on layer of rock art. And so these are mostly Basket Maker 2 figures that are here, but you can see wherever I've outlined in black that there's Glen Canyon Style 5 figures that are superimposed by the later Basket Maker 2. And quite close to that previous photograph, this is a very typical Glen Canyon Style 5 sheep, when you can see the vertical and horizontal lines inside the body with, again, the really square cornered body. And then, if you look right down here below it, you've got Basket Maker 2 figures, and I'll explain that in just a second. So, it's really easy, I think, again, to come up with our own pattern recognition. For me, it's important to try to learn styles, because styles helps me think about who made these figures. And then the next question I ask is, why did they put them here? But I think it's important to start with the who, because that gives me a kind of some temporal context for when they were done and what things might have looked like and been like back then and what kind of life they were leading. So the next archaic style of rock art is Great Basin Curvilinear. Heiser and Baumhoff, had a description in 1962. These are abstract figures, circles, concentric circles, chains of circles, and all kinds of meandering things going on. They tend to fill the area defined by the outline of a single boulder. In Utah, we see Great Basin Curvilinear mostly to the west side of the I-15. And many Utah sites, interestingly, have anthropomorphic elements. You know, there could have been things going on here with, you know, early Fremont coming in and putting images there, or transition from these archaic people to the later Fremont people. And many Utah sites have figures from multiple time periods and reuse, for example, at Utah Lake and Stansbury. So older figures tend to have deep and wide pecking with a high degree of repatination, often to the point of matching the rock surface. And the pecking is often very, very fine, which you can see here. I mean, there's not a lot of individual dimples in there. It's really kind of been smoothed out and very, very heavily repatinated. And another figure that you can see how we've got pecking along the top edge of this boulder. And then this figure down here, which, you know, may be abstract, it might be a plant, but it fits nicely with that Kaiser and Bonhoeffer, you know, trying to fill the side of the rock that it's on. Some more curvilinear Great Basin archaic rock art. And, you know, this might be an anthropomorphic figure, or it might simply be an abstract that my brain is interpreting as an anthropomorph, because that's what I want to do with my brain, is I want to find meaning there. And again, look at this one on the left. This looks much more anthropomorphic and very heavily repatinated, very nicely, deeply, evenly pecked. And then, you know, a less repatinated one over here on the right. More figures on the left. Again, this area on the far left side has some anthropomorphic elements. And if we were down in Nevada, that might be like a Paranagit kind of man or something like that. But, you know, it's hard to, you know, again, we look at things like that and the brain wants to look at it and say, you know, that is anthropomorphic, because anthropomorphism is something that we're used to identifying. We want to look at people and know who they are. But whether it is or not, you know, this is an abstract panel, and that simply may be an abstract figure. And again, just a couple more examples. And I love to think of this one as a butterfly. And again, I don't know if it's just my brain making that decision for me, or if it's supposed to be an abstract figure. So the last archaic style that we're going to talk about in Utah is the Barrier Canyon style. This particular photograph is from the Great Gallery, which is the type site for the Barrier Canyon style. Over on the right, I've got David Sussek's definition of Barrier Canyon, and many of you have heard Sussek talk about this several times, but I think it's a great definition. You know, elongated figures tapering down towards the bottom, often without arms and legs. He talks about different types of figures in Barrier Canyon. So these large figures are what he calls spirit figures. And he says they're bilateral symmetrically, which means that if you took a line and you put it right down the middle of the body, the left side would typically mirror the right side. Round, oversized goggle eyes, shoulder bars, and compositions apparently representing friendly associations with animals, birds, snakes, and plant images. And I'll show you lots of pictures of that. I think you've got probably a snake image here. And again, there's, you know, different kinds of figures often around here. He talks about 3 primary types of Barrier Canyon figures that have different design elements to them. The other thing that I've noticed about Barrier Canyon is that it's what I call anthropocentric. So Barrier Canyon rock art style is the only rock art style in Utah that I know of that's always about the humanoid looking figures. They are the largest figures. They're the central point of all the rock art sites. You know, it's not like a site where you'll see 100 sheep and no anthropomorphs at all. Just for your own curiosity, we've got superimposition here. There's another Barrier Canyon figure inside this Barrier Canyon figure. So we've got superimposition of 2 Barrier Canyon figures here. This is what's called the Holy Ghost figure, and it's also, again, at the same site. Again, this is, a Mormon cultural influence. We're taking something that's thousands of years old and applying a cultural reference to the people who probably first found this and said, you know what, in our culture, we talk about the Holy Ghost and we think this is what we're seeing here. Oh, we just saw that one. This is in the San Rafael Swell. These are much smaller figures. These are, a couple feet high as opposed to the, 8-foot high figures that we were seeing in the previously. You can still see those narrowing, tapering bodies. These ones often do have legs and they do have short arms in some cases. This figure here in the center is interesting because it looks like it has bird feet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But this panel, I think, is interesting because it appears that it's been ritually obliterated. Marks taken out of the torso in all of these main figures here, and even this little figure here, which I think is interesting. This is at the same panel. We talked about, friendly co-location with animals, and you can certainly see that here. This is these little birds that are flying up and down between these Barrier Canyon figures are probably, a little bit larger than your thumbnail. A big kind of bird over here. We've got a snake image here. We've got sheep, just teeny tiny little sheep over the top here. Other birds up here. It's really fascinating. The Barrier Canyon people definitely had attention to detail. These are probably plant figures to the left, but again, that's just my guess, from my kind of cultural viewpoint of what it would be. And this is a lesser known site that's in the San Rafael Swell. Again, this snake figure here with the horned snake, which again, what's the purpose of the horns? I don't know why they're there. And it just looks like it's dripping venom, and it has arms or feet as it's coming up, which is unusual as well. To this Barrier Canyon figure here, we see what appears to be a nice grass figure. And this bird, which seems to be kind of in transformation with long legs down here. This is the Head of Sinbad panel, which I used to try and keep secret, but I think it's all over the internet now, so I can use that name. It's a beautiful panel, again, with, some kind of a zoomorphic, we call them helper figures. These two plants and a snake up to the top, and this beautiful figure here. And just to the left of this panel, we've got another one, again, with more snakes. We've got things flying around, and I'm going to do a close-up. We've got little teeny tiny birds flying over what appear to be two plants growing out of this person's head. Birds flying around and some kind of unknown objects off here to the left, and a spiral in the chest. It's a fantastic panel. We talked about Sago Thompson. We showed you the Fremont site that the Ute friend said, his grandfather had gone back and repecked. This is the Barrier Canyon site just around the corner. And again, when you talk to a lot of people, they mention alien eyes, these great big huge round eyes that are frequent within the Barrier Canyon. But again, that's our own cultural motif that we're using to identify those eyes. Beautiful panels, very nice stuff. Here's a little close-up of the site. Again, a lot of snakes in Barrier Canyon rock art. And this is a really small Barrier Canyon panel. It's maybe 12 inches tall. And it's interesting because, again, we've got those bird feet down at the bottom. It looks like it has a tail, a humanoid type body, human arms coming out, maybe with a snake coming down here. We've got what looks like a goat's head or a sheep's head with horns coming off and a snake coming out of the mouth, and one of those little helper figures kind of standing on the arm. And then we've got these little teeny tiny sheep. These sheep are about the size of your pinky finger, coming up towards the figure and then moving away from it as it gets further away. One of the things that I think is interesting about this is that anthropomorphic figures are almost all facing you dead on. So the face is facing you. I think that's because that's how we identify people, and the artist knew that. I think it's interesting when we see anthropomorphic figures in a sideways format like this. And I think the reason is that it was important for the artist to depict the animal kind of elements in this anthropomorphic figure. And I think when you see animals, we almost always see them from a sideways perspective, because again, that's how we identify animals. It's harder to identify them straight on. It's much easier when we see them from the side. So Fremont style rock art. Again, applying our own cultural metaphors to things, so the Fremont style rock art gets its name because this location, which is the type site for the Fremont civilization, was found next to a river that was named after John C. Fremont, who was one of the early explorers. So we named a river after John C. Fremont, and then we found the culture near that river, and so we named the culture after a guy who clearly wasn't here at the time that the culture was here. But we have no idea what they called themselves. So I guess we have to give them some kind of a name. But again, the Fremont, wide-shouldered trapezoidal bodies that flare out below the waist, these bucket heads that kind of look rectangular or squarish, that are often narrower at the neck. The feet tend to point outward rather than down. They occasionally have tear lines in the eyes. The pecking and size varies by region. It often has elaborate body decorations and often has elaborate headdress decorations. And this is right in Capitol Reef National Park. There's a huge pullout here. You wouldn't have any trouble finding this site if you want to go to it. This is at McConkey Ranch. It's the Three Kings panel. And we tend to focus our eyes on this big figure here in the center. It's a fantastic figure. If you look at that, I mean, it's been pecked, it's been abraded, it's been drilled, and then it has been painted over the top of. Somebody went to a lot of work to make that figure. It is just absolutely stunning. And it fits all the common kind of definitions of the Fremont style. The head isn't that typical bucket-shaped head, but really elaborate body decorations. The trapezoidal body flaring out a little bit at the waist, the feet facing sideways. Something here, maybe a medicine bundle, or some people are thinking about headhunting in this region. It's hard to tell, and again, we're applying some of our own cultural metaphors to that. It's hard to know exactly what they were trying to do. These fantastic spirals on either side, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, so 5 fantastic Fremont elements there. I don't know why they call it the Three Kings. But again, that's our own cultural metaphors being applied to something that really doesn't make a lot of sense for. And then there's this figure here, and we tend to just ignore this figure. It doesn't really fit into any context we have. And again, I think this is the brain, as our brains start to think about styles, it develops pattern recognition for styles, and it goes, oh yes, Fremont, 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 have no idea what that is. I'm just going to ignore it over there. This is perhaps one of the most unique elements in all of Utah. In some respects, it has kind of a basket maker look to it. It has these hanging feet with the toes going straight down, and the hanging hands with the hands going straight down. But the pecking is completely bizarre because it's what we would call in modern artistic reference bas relief. So instead of really pecking out the body, as all of these have been done, they've pecked around the outside of the body and left the body more or less intact. It is much more laborious to do this. It's really hard work. It's not impossible that this is Basket Maker 2. There is Basket Maker 2 archaeology fairly close to here, but I've never seen a Basket Maker 2 site pecked this way. I've never seen a large pecked image pecked this way. I've seen some painted images pecked this way, including anthropomorphs. But this is a really unusual element, and I think we tend to skip over it just because our brain doesn't know what to do with it, and so it kind of ignores it. And again, I'm not going to go through these in too much detail. You can see these tear marks off the side of the eyes. This is again at McConkey Ranch. Elaborate body decorations, sashes at the waist, trapezoidal body. This is McKee Springs, same kind of area up near Vernal. This is, now we're back in 9 Mile Canyon. We've got these, I had a French film crew that gave me a call and they said, hey, you know, could we get some help locating some sites? And I said, okay. And so they came and they said, well, we want to find the alien panel in 9 Mile Canyon. And I said, the alien panel? I don't know of an alien panel. And he digs around. The picture of the site, and I said, oh, well, we call that the family panel. Again, you know, I have no idea if it's a family or not a panel or not. You know, we're all interpreting these things from some of our own cultural biases. It's our brain kind of finding patterns in whatever way that it can. Over to the right, we have an interesting shield figure here. And to the left, and I'm really sorry I cut that guy off, but a bow and arrow, which is a temporal diagnostic. The bow and arrow comes into Utah about 500 AD. So it's a temporal clue as to this panel has to have been made after about 500 AD. This is one of the more famous panels in Utah. It's the Great Hunt Scene. It's just off of 9 Mile Canyon. It's on Sitla land, state trust land, and they've done a really nice job of protecting this site and moving the road away from it and doing some nice interpretation. It's a fascinating site. I think we've got this one anthropomorph that's very typical Fremonty looking kind of thing in the figure. And it's again facing front on. And then we've got these figures down here, which are all sideways. And I think in this case, it's important for them to be facing sideways because it's an action orientation. They're all hunting. They've got their bows and arrows out and they appear to be shooting the sheep. So I think that sideways look at them is important when it happens, and that it's either implying movement or action, or there's some kind of element associated with them that's really important that you can only see by looking at the side. All of these sheep are connected by lines coming from the head over to the next creature. And they're different stylistically. These at the top have all these forward facing feet over here, and then these don't. And you've got this weird kind of wiener shaped sheep down here. So there's a lot of interesting things in this panel, and I don't really know what to make of all of it. Again, another Fremont panel in 9 Mile Canyon. This is one of my favorite panels. You can see just these extreme narrow waists, the trapezoidal body coming down and then flaring out. What I like about this panel is that you've got one anthropomorph here, another here, another here, another here, another here, and another here. And they're all wearing different kind of designs, different clothing styles. And then down at the bottom, we've got these what we call burden basket people, who we're assume are carrying baskets on their back. And we've actually seen that in the archaeology. And again, they're shown from the side. And I think it's important because they're moving, they're carrying something, they're transporting something. And this is a Fremont figure that doesn't have the traditional Fremont body, but it does have that kind of upside down bucket head. It's in the Fremont region. I think this is a large shield that's in front of it, and that's why it's square and rather than the typical body, and it's in what's called an X-ray view where we can see the body and behind it. And down near the Escalante region, I guess there's a sign showing you where this figure is, so it's just off of the Calf Creek campground. And we've got at least 3 Fremont images here. There's an arm coming down from something that used to be here. That would be interesting to de-stretch that and see if there's still something that is visible. But these figures are all holding hands. We've got superimposition here, and then we've got a Barrier Canyon figure down here in the lower right. But again, you know, fancy headdresses, tapering bodies flaring out at the waist. This is nice Fremont figurines, and still we're right in a Fremont ancestral Puebloan transition area here. And this is Fremont Indian State Park, which is a wonderful place. And this is actually quite a large figure. And it's not quite as prototypical as the vernal style figures. It's quite a long ways away from vernal, but it still has those Fremont characteristics. So moving into basket maker rock art. The basket makers had wide shoulders, trapezoidal bodies, round heads, often with hair bobs, elaborate hands and feet with fingers and toes hanging straight down in what's often called a pendant style. So you can see that here, and you can see the feet hanging straight down with the toes hanging straight down. The bodies are often not solidly packed, and occasionally we have bird and duck-headed figures on some of the anthropomorphs, and you can see that over here on the right. So we've got an anthropomorph with the head, hair bobs coming down, but on top of the head we have this giant bird. And I think this is a pretty figure to the left as well, with some kind of an arm tassel here. This was one of the very first basket maker sites that I saw, and I knew nothing about rock art at the time. And I had gone to the Sand Island campground, and I'd looked at the Sand Island site, and the campground host came over and said, "Do you like rock art?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Do you know about the Wolfman panel?" And I said, "No." And they gave me instructions, and they said, "Go over and look at that site and then come back and tell us whether you think it's old or new." And so I came out and I found this site, and it was just so beautiful. It's such a lovely site. And I looked at those legs and the detailed musculature in the legs, and I said, "Oh, well, this is obviously new." Again, it's my brain thinking in the patterns that it recognizes, and it, you know, I didn't know about how to look at style back then, so I didn't recognize these hands hanging straight down and these feet hanging straight down and the twin lobed circles and all these things that we see in basket maker style rock art. So I came back and I told them, "Oh, that's clearly a new panel. It's just way too nice to be an old panel." And that was my brain kind of hijacking what I should have known or what I knew later. Basket Maker 2, this is going back to that Butler Wash panel. Fantastic figures with, again, hands hanging down, feet hanging down, round heads, weird things coming out of the heads. It's a beautiful Basket Maker 2 panel, and a lot of other styles here as well. This is just an odd panel, but it's still, the body form, you know, doesn't really fit with a lot of the other body forms, but the hands and feet certainly do, and this really looks basket maker to me. And this is on the San Juan River. It's a famous panel called the Desecration Panel. Again, it's basket maker 2. And there's a great story about this where a Navajo family that was living nearby got sick, and they called in the medicine man. And the medicine man determined that this panel was doing something to make them sick. And so he asked them to go and collect sand from the panel. And they came and they, you know, so they chiseled away at the panel, collected the sand, and then the sand was used in a ceremony to help cure their sickness. Now, Puebloan style rock art. The anthropomorphs tend to be drawn as stick figures or triangular bodied. They still have the round heads and they still have the hair bobs. The panels seem a lot less complex and often have more abstract elements. there are often long line of hand-holding dancing figures, and I assume they're dancers. I don't know. Again, that's my brain interpreting that cultural reference. And there's positive and negative handprints and shield figures. So I have a theory about why the rock art changes when it comes into the Puebloan style, and I think it's because of the introduction of the kiva. And we know that in the kivas, they're doing a lot of kind of religious symbolism. And so I think the importance of kind of religion and ceremony moves indoors and away from the rock art sites. But again, that's my cultural bias, placing a solution on a problem that I have and that I don't know quite how to resolve. This is an example from Grand Gulch of a fairly abstract panel. It's beautiful, these spiral motifs you see in just about every culture everywhere, but long lines and zigzag lines, and this is a nice example of an abstract ancestral Puebloan panel. You do see some anthropomorphs down here, which are fairly simple and conform with kind of the general definition that we talked about before. Another panel that is mostly abstract. It has some zoomorphic elements in here. This is in St. George, I believe. And again, we're back to some of these simple, again, anthropomorphic figures and some more complex, looks like some tracks and things like that over here. I love this figure. We talk about simple stick figures, but there's a lot of beauty in some of these figures. I think this is just an absolutely stunning figure. This is down along the Arizona Strip area, a really pretty site. And again, these much more simple figures that we're seeing here that are Puebloan, I think, in time frame. They don't have the pendant hands and pendant feet. And again, this interesting figure that actually looks a lot like that one that I just showed you a little bit ago. This is an example right along Potash Road, just outside of Moab, of these lines of triangular bodied figures holding hands, and they may be dancing, it may be a ceremony, it may be something completely different that I just don't even know about. And this beautiful bird down in just near Bluff, again, ancestral Puebloan. This is what we call a positive handprint, where the paint is applied to the hand and then the hand is put on the rock art surface, and they've actually drawn the design into their hand before they put their hand on the surface. And over here on the left, we've got a negative handprint where they put the hand on the rock face and then blow the paint around it, and then positive handprints over here to the right. And I'm going to show you a blow up of this panel here, so that it's the same site. We've got these nice ancestral Puebloan people with these huge kind of full body shields, big round shields, these dots going over that we saw in the previous ones. And what's interesting is that we've got superimposition. There's Barrier Canyon figures here, Barrier Canyon figures here, Barrier Canyon figures here. They're so faint. You really have to be there in the right kind of lighting or do a little bit of work in Photoshop like I did to, see them easily here. Cave Valley style is a really unusual style in Utah. I'm not, we're still kind of debating what it is and if it's its own style or if it's a variation of something else. But it's in a fairly small geographic area. They have a fascination with triangles, short stubby arms and legs, hands and feet are rarely depicted. They may have a square blocky head, but oftentimes they're kind of triangular in shape. And the number of sites is fairly small. It's anthropocentric. It's mostly people kind of looking figures. And the geographic area is still debated because we're not even really sure how to define the style that well. This is kind of a heavily photoshopped figure that I took because it's in a back of a dark cave, but you can really see, triangular head, triangular body, triangular arms, triangular legs coming off of all of this, and it's repeated here and it's repeated here. So these are really kind of prototypical Cave Valley style figures. Again, another nice triangular shaped body with, less of the other triangular elements going on, and some more here. And on this beautiful boulder, and a painted figure here. So now jumping forward, now we're getting into Ute rock art. This is, we're going back to Thompson, Sago Thompson again. The beautiful thing about that site is that there's 3 different styles and ages of rock art there. There's the Fremont, the Barrier Canyon, and the Ute. Ute rock art is really difficult for me to define from a stylistic standpoint. I don't really see a lot of commonality from panel to panel. I tend to look for temporal and cultural elements: rifles, bison, cowboys, horses, bears. Bison were really important to the Ute. The Ute got the horse first in Utah, and they kind of made sure that the Paiute never got the horse. And so once they got the horse, they were much more mobile and they were able to go out to the plains. And I think they got really influenced by Plains Indian culture that was heavily influenced by the buffalo. And you can see rifles here. You can see this beautiful shield. You can see the bison. You can see the horses. Horses and bison and bears and things like that are really indicative of Ute style rock art. Just one second. Ute rock art is often placed where other rock art is located. They seem to reuse and mimic rock art. So you'll find what looks like Ute rock art that's mimicking Barrier Canyon rock art in some cases. Red paint, but the paint doesn't seem quite right. The fingers don't seem quite right. They'll put a buffalo skull in there, but it's right beside a Barrier Canyon panel or another panel. And then we've got metal tools being used as well, as we talked about with that one really nice owl. Here again, this is the prototypical Ute panel, this Newspaper Rock State Park. It's just fantastic. It's extraordinary rock art. And there's a lot of things that we could interpret there. A small panel that's down in southern Utah, pretty buffalo that's been pecked, and more buffalo here. We can see a rider on a horse with just a huge lance that looks like they're hunting the buffalo, but with some sheep in here as well. Lots of sheep in here, quite actually. And we've already showed this panel again. This is a Ute panel with that deep wide pecking that's there. And I'm getting close to wrapping up here, so hopefully I'm not going too long. Paiute style, this whole section is thanks to Nina Bowen. It includes both abstract and representative elements. There's far fewer zoomorphic images than there are in other styles, and the anthropomorphs don't have a consistent style, but tend to have long rectangular bodies. And the easy way to identify this style, if you're in the right geographical area, is that there's very little repatination. And again, there's mimicry and reuse of sites. So they're adding their elements to sites that earlier people have put images on. And you can see that right here. You can see the background imagery that's a lot darker. It's repatinated. And then we've got Paiute figures that are over the top here. And somebody in the pre-chat was asking about this site. This is Black Mountain. And again, some abstract images here from the Paiute. You can see that we've got older, darker images, and then the newer, lighter imagery that's been added over the top. Nina thinks that this site is here because of the nest here, the hawk nest. And again, we've got older images below and newer images above. And same thing here and here. So again, reuse and mimicry of sites. It may have been that they're looking and saying, if that site was important to somebody else, then maybe it should be important to us here. This site here looks like it's had a lightning strike that's come down and has impacted the rock, and that may be why that site is there. Okay, so a couple of last slides. Other tools in your quiver. One of my favorite experiences at a rock art site was a trip into Grand Gulch, and I was there with a group of 12 of us. We were backpacking. It was a really hot day. We had our packs on, and it got to be lunchtime, and we found this big panel off in a bend, and it was in a shadow, and we just kind of hit the ground and got our food out, and we spent close to an hour at that site. And after we finished eating, people started to say, look at that image up there. What do you think about that? And look over here and look over there. And we just had a fantastic time. And I saw things that I would never have seen simply because I was with other people who were looking at the panel in a different way. And we had the time to stay there to really think about what we were seeing. So visit sites with other people, talk, explore, and look at other perspectives. Read material from people with different specialties. Kahneman, who's an economist and a social psychologist, he's helped me think differently about rock art. Artists, psychologists, archaeologists, cultural experts, the people who actually know what we're talking about here. There's a lot we can learn from them. I think documentation is one of the best way to see rock art differently. We were out documenting a site down in Indian Creek with Pam and Quent Baker. And Pam was doing a different section than I was. And all of a sudden she started yelling. And we all ran down to where Pam was. And she says, look, she says, there is Glen Canyon style 5 imagery here that's superimposed by the ancestral Puebloan imagery, but it's just scratch imagery. It's almost impossible to see. And unless you have your nose right to the rock, you would never, ever have seen it. I like checklists. It forces yourself to look for specific characteristics. I was out in the spring with a group of archaeologists, and we were going through the IMAX sheet. And one of the fellows says, do you see incorporation here? Because that's one of the questions that's on the checklist. And, I hadn't even thought about it, but I looked for incorporation and there it was, and it's so easy you get enamored with the big figures and you sometimes miss those little things that are there that I think are really important. And travel, I think, is important. I think it's important to experience different styles and different locations because it helps you to think about your rock art at home differently and use different tools to observe differently. There's tons of photographic tools out now. We talk a lot about D-Stretch, but there's a lot of different photographic tools. There's a lot of technological tools that we can use to understand rock art. And the last thing is, I really think one of the things that I noticed when I was putting this talk together is that I tend to focus on individual images. And I don't stop to think about why the panel is located where it is in the landscape. And it's nowhere in my photographs. And it's something that I'm really lacking because my brain doesn't think that way. So that's it. My conclusions are we use 2 different thinking processes, a fast pattern seeking method and a slow database method. Our fast brain process will create patterns even where they don't exist. And the way that the brain thinks is invisible to us, so we don't even know that it's doing that. Fast processes can lead to poor conclusions. We have a broad variety of tools to use to slow down our mental processes and to think about styles, to think about who and why and not necessarily the what. And that's it. I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Troy. So let's see. I think maybe to take questions, you might want to keep your slide deck available because I suspect that people might have questions about your specific slide. So at this point in time, if anybody does have some questions, please use the chat, and then we can go through that and direct them to Troy. So yeah, I know you got a lot of slides there, Troy. So let's see. I'm going to try to just work through them in order here. So, I mean, someone was wondering about the interpretation of aliens. You did have an example of aliens. I don't know whether you want to talk about that. I mean, we kind of laugh at it, but why do you think so many people respond to the notion of aliens in rock art?
Well, partly it's the way we describe aliens. So, we often have pictures of them with great big eyes and things like that. And so, you look at rock art and you see things with eyes and you go, okay, well, that looks like ET. Or I watched that, what was the one show, something, the something of the gods, where, the gods had come down and built the pyramids and did all this stuff. And, I
Right.
think we get that in our mind and it's hard to let it go. And so again, our brain is trying to process things based on things that we know culturally. Now, the original makers of the rock art, I don't think they'd have thought about aliens. At least they wouldn't have thought about aliens in the same way that we do. But we have those images in our head, and so we look at stuff and our mind just jumps to interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. So here's another. You kind of dealt with the notion of style throughout your entire talk, but what would you give as sort of a simple definition of style?
Yeah, I wish there was a simple definition of style. Um, there's kind of two different ways of thinking about style. There's an artistic way of thinking about style, and the artistic way is simply kind of patterns. Again, I'll go back to my friend David Susek. He often starts his talks by showing a picture of the Utah Capitol building, and he says, stylistically, this is, a Greek style building, right? It has columns, it has porticos, it has domes, and that's what we would see in a Greco-Roman building. But, if you look at how it's built, it's built with cement and rebar instead of marble and sandstone. So there's one style that simply is, when you look at it, how does it appear in context of the way other people did things? So for example, David, I showed David an anthropomorph that was right in the middle of a big Fremont panel. It was clearly a Fremont panel. The figure had the same repatination as everything around it, but it stylistically, it looked Barrier Canyon, long tapered body. And so for David, that's style, right? He looks at it from an artistic standpoint. It has the same elements that the Barrier Canyon people put into their images. So even if a Fremont person made it, it's a Barrier Canyon style image. I tend to think about style in terms of who was the actual creator of the image. So I'm thinking about it in terms of who made it. And that's a different way of thinking about style. So if there's a Barrier Canyon looking image in the middle of a Fremont panel, I'm going to say that's a Fremont figure, not a Barrier Canyon figure.
So you're using the context to identify it, but I mean that wouldn't be really using style, would it?
I think it's still style because the Fremont people had a style in terms of what they were doing with rock art, and if the Fremont people made that figure, I mean the style may not perfectly fit, but it's still a Fremont figure. So it's a different way. It's a different way of looking at style. It's an archaeological way of thinking about style rather than an artistic way of thinking about style.
Right. Some of us may call that culture rather than style, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. I'm looking at who identifies it. So you're right. It's the Fremont culture is making that figure.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of styles, you might want to go back to your Great Hunt panel. Someone suggested that the patination on the Great Hunt panel suggests that it is of Ute origin, and also the family panel could be Ute. So maybe you can go back and review what your thoughts were in terms of style in that.
Um, I think it's certainly possible. When I look at this figure here, to me that looks very Fremonty. It has the wide shoulders, the bucket head, the tapering waist. But again, I really struggle with Ute in terms of the style of rock art from the Ute. I think they do mimic other styles. I don't think they have a definitive style that says, we always do our anthropomorphs this way. So I really I wouldn't fight anybody on that. I think it's a perfectly logical interpretation. Um, to simply look at repatination, repatination is tough. So I tend to think about repatination on a comparative basis. So for example, at the Newspaper Rock State Park, where you could see the Fremont in the top right that was darker and the Ute and the rest of the panel that was much lighter, that's a nice comparative contrast. It's really hard to simply look at patination when there's nothing to contrast it to, because it's so different. The way it's facing, the way the wind blows, the way the sun blows, the way the wind hits it, all impacts the way the panel repatinates. So unless you have some contrasting elements, I think patination in and of itself isn't a good dating technique.
Yeah, one thing that's definitely noticeable on this panel, and you pointed it out, was the way that each sheep is connected to the other one. And maybe that's something that shows up in other art that could be more, have stylistic features that are more readily identifiable.
Yeah,
Have
that's
you,
a
have
good
you seen
question.
otherwise?
And one of the other and I didn't tell this story, and since we're here, there's a guy named Levan Martineau who wrote a book called The Rocks Begin to Speak, and he was an Anglo, but he married a Paiute woman and spent a lot of time with the Paiute and a lot of time with other Native American tribes. And he interpreted this panel as saying the sheep aren't sheep, they're people, they're tribes. They're not tribes, but they're groups of people who are fleeing that area with this central figure kind of leading them, because they're being hunted by these other figures down here. And again, that's something we're very literal. We see sheep and we see sheep, and a different cultural interpretation is that, the sheep aren't sheep, they're people. It's just a different way of depicting people or groups of people.
Right. Although you wouldn't expect the people to be going towards the hunters if that were
Yeah,
the
that's a
case.
good
This is
question.
kind of more like a sheep drive where they're.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one.
Okay, so there's another question about bears, which you had mentioned in relation to Ute style. And I guess somebody was asking what was the temporal cultural information about bears.
Well, so the interesting element, there's more of a cultural thing rather than a temporal thing there, but the Utes have a very important ceremony called the bear dance. And it's a key ceremony for them. And it's just often when you look at Ute panels, you'll see bear paws or you'll see bear imagery within the panels. It doesn't mean that it's exclusive to Ute. I looked at a shot when I was putting this together that had a big bear image. And when I had originally put that in, I'd put it in as a Ute image, but I decided that, there was no way to really determine that bear was Ute, because there was kind of ancestral Puebloan figures all around the bear. So I took it out. So I don't think the bear's exclusively Ute, but I think they really liked bear imagery in their panels.
Yeah, okay. I think that covers most of the questions. We got a lot of compliments in the chat. So if anybody does have a last question you'd like to sneak in before we close out, this is your chance. Um, okay, let's see. Nope, just more compliments, Troy. And actually, I think I probably share the thoughts of most of the people that you did get us thinking about the way we look at rock art and sort of our automatic responses to things. So it was kind of refreshing to have you uh, make us introspect a little bit on the way we think about looking at rock art. So
Well, thank you.
thank you for that. So you probably can unshare your screen now,
Okay.
and we'll just again say thanks to Troy, who is our ARARA treasurer and webmaster. Thanks again to all the attendees for your interests. And if you would like to learn more about ARARA, please do check out our website, our Facebook pages. Remind you that our next event on November 13th will be David Lee speaking on yet another provocative topic, how rock art fits into the lives of the people who made it. And now we'll be getting probably some interpretation from elders and such that might have some direct relationship to the rock art. So that should be really interesting. You can visit our, as I said, our website or Facebook page for more information on that. So until then, good evening, everybody, and stay safe.
Thanks.